Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by Doxity in partnership with Espol Lille. My name is Carolina, nice to meet you all, and I'll be your host for today's event on behalf of Doxity. I see here that the first people are already starting to join in. We're going to wait a few minutes before starting to allow everyone to connect. In the meantime, feel free to say hi on our chat here in Zoom, and please tell us where you are from since we are very curious. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us and thank our panelists for being here with us today. I want to introduce you all to Johannes Karemans, Director of the Master's Program and also Professor of Political Science and Head of Master in Multi-Level Governance in Europe. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Together with Johannes, we're going to discuss the role of states as formal vehicles of political power, and we will explore how the different MA programs at Espol address the theme of state power in the modern era. You'll also have the possibility to interact with our speaker and ask him questions. And talking about that, I'd like to remind you that after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you'll be able to ask direct questions to the panelists. So don't be shy and just type all of your questions in the Q&A section here on Zoom, and we'll go through them at the end of the webinar. Also, for those of you interested in receiving a certificate of attendance by Doxity for this free masterclass, stay tuned because we will post a link to get the certificate at the end of the session. So I think that we are able to start now. Welcome to those who just joined us. And without further ado, I'm now leaving the floor to Johannes for his presentation. Thank you so much, and we'll see you later. Enjoy.
Okay. So let me share the screen. All right. My name is Johannes Karemans. I'm a professor of political science here at the European School of Political and Social Sciences at the Catholic University of Lille. I will give a talk about state transformations in the 21st century. And for this topic, I take the opportunity to give a bit of an overview of what are the main themes of teaching, but also of research that we do here at Espol. First, a few words about myself. So my main research areas are comparative politics, political economy, multi-level governance, public policy. This year at Espol, I'm teaching four courses, three of which in the master program, that is public policy analysis, which is an introductory course to public policy that I give to first-year students. Then I teach a course on the influence of international organizations on government's policies, which is a course for second-year master students. And then again, for first-year master students, I teach a course on European economic governance. That is a course on how economic policy decisions are being taken in the European Union. And then at the bachelor level, I also teach a course on the introduction to the law and institutions of the European Union. I'd also like to emphasize a bit of self-promotion. I have a new book coming out entitled Between Voters and Bureaucrats, How Do Governments Justify Their Budgets? I am mentioning this because this is a little bit, the topic of my book is a bit linked to the topic of my talk today. And so it also gives you a bit of an insight of the type of themes we deal with here at Espol. In the book, I discuss how governments today are on the one hand expected to comply to the expectations of a national democracy where there are voters voting, but at the same time there are also the expectations of what we can call the bureaucrats, so the European institutions, and it's not always easy to match these expectations. And that is what I deal with in the book. And in the talk today, I will talk a bit more broadly on how states are changing nowadays, how political power is no longer in the places where we always think it is. So we have to find new ways to identify political power, and that is what we try to do here in the master program. has happened with my slides. I cannot. Oh. Okay. Sorry, something. Okay. This is the next slide. This is just a slide to, this is the political map, more or less, of today. Just to indicate that the political map, the world map of today is still structured around the idea of nation states. That is, the world is divided in political units that is shaped by territory. Political units are sort of, their jurisdictions is over a territory where there are more or less physical borders. And this is one way to look at this is that this is a bit of an inheritance of the past, where human interactions of the past century, in a way, where human interactions were mostly taking place within national borders. Human interactions, both culturally, socially, but also economically. So also trade would happen within national borders. And also political power was then organized at a national level. So the political authorities of our countries would have control over what was happening within that country. My talk tonight is a little bit about how this is changing nowadays. Before we proceed, let me introduce a few key concepts, and this also gives the idea of how I start many of my courses. I want to clarify what are we talking about when we use terms such as public policy, authority, or legitimacy. Public policy is about decisions that are collectively binding, so that they are decisions to which all members of a community, so often it's a national community, have to abide. So, and it's for this reason that public policy coincides with the actions of public authority, and that is why we generally associate it with the government, because it's governments making generally collective binding decisions. So decisions to which all members of a community are expected to comply with. Authority is the legitimate exercise of power. So that is those entities, those actors that actually legitimately make collective binding decisions. And what is legitimacy? Legitimacy is about the standards by which we accept these collective binding decisions. So we accept that our governments make our decisions for us, and let's say overall we can group these standards by which we accept these collective binding decisions into groups. Those that we can call input legitimacy, that is the procedures by which the decision makers are appointed. And in democracies, that is generally elections. So we tend to accept what governments decide for us because we tend to elect these governments. And then also output legitimacy, in the sense that we accept these collective binding decisions because we tend to believe that what the government is doing is actually good for us. So overall, we are happy with education policies, with health policies, etc., etc. And these are, of course, contested issues. But overall, we accept what government does for us, A, because we elected for it, so the procedures by which the government has been put in place, and B, because the government to some extent delivers a public good. So two more concepts. Government. So government is the institution that traditionally controls, administers, and importantly for political scientists, that gives direction to a collectivity. So it's the institution that exercises state authority. So it's this institution where all these three concepts that I listed previously sort of all come together. And for the political world, until not so long ago, was dominated by governments. Everything was in the hand of national governments. In political science nowadays, however, we speak more and more of the concept of governance rather than governments, because we observe more and more that public policy is not only delivered by governments. We observe that authority is not only within governments, and we observe and political power more generally is not only in the hands of governments. So we speak of governance, which is a concept that indicates the act of governing in states, among states, above states, and by non-state actors. And it's about authority being shared by global institutions, regional institutions, national governments, and subnational institutions, and in some cases, as you will see today, also by non-state actors, such as, for example, private actors. So governance is about how we are giving direction to the collectivity, not necessarily through governments, but through this whole constellation of actors. And this is something new. Until not so long ago, we were taking for granted that the direction to the collectivity was given by governments. But now we're speaking of governance because there are other actors involved in political decision making. So when we speak of state transformations, let's emphasize a bit how it used to be. Collective binding decisions were made by these national states that control these national territories. And the state had the power to enforce these rules, and it did not really need the assistance of other actors. So the state had the power to collect taxes and to spend the money effectively to deliver public goods. And the compliance was ensured by the fact that the national communities were happy with the procedures by which these state authorities, so the government, were appointed, and more or less they were also happy with the public goods being produced. So how it used to be, the political world, let's say since 1945, so the end of the World War, so the political authorities sort of cling back within these national borders, and all of the collective decision making, so the decision making for big communities was made at the state national level, and human interaction was taking place largely within national borders, and these human interactions, states had power over these human interactions that were taken within national borders. Then, and this has happened also repeatedly over history, we started human interaction, let's say, started exiting the borders of states, and we started seeing international trade increasing gradually. And the more this happened, of course, the more that there were collective problems that could not be solved at the state level, but had to be solved at an international level. And this process increased even further with global, sorry, I don't see the full part of the screen. So with developments such as globalization, which means that globalization essentially means that territory becomes less important for defining where human interactions take place. So human interactions take place also across long distances. Deindustrialization, that is another process by which the industrial sector became less important, and then more recently digitalization. All these processes have facilitated developments by which human interactions were taking place across different territories that were no longer shaped by national borders, and so were taking place globally. And this entailed that also collective problems started to emerge in spaces that were outside the control of nation states. And one of the first solutions that was found for this, of course, or one of the most immediate solutions that was found for this, was the establishment of international organizations. So that is organizations that are still backed by the So I apologize for these interruptions, but something is not going right in the slides. So one of the first solutions was to establish international organizations that had the backing of state power, and they were given the let's say the task of solving cross-national problems. So if you would have a lot of trade between different countries, we would establish an international organization that would sort of act as an independent referee, overseeing that both parties, both countries were complying to fair rules of this trade. What happened at the same time also is that within states, we started seeing, because of these global developments, we started seeing increased levels of liberalization and delegation by which public services were given in the hands of private actors. That is, for example, railways were no longer controlled by states, but were given increasingly to private companies. That means that public goods were no longer delivered by a state, but were being delivered by other actors, by non-state actors. And also governments who started delegating a lot of their traditional competences to smaller independent agencies. And so as a result of this, we also started seeing a growing amount of non-state actors gaining authority. So these three developments, the growing international organizations on the one hand, and then the privatization of key public services and the delegation of rulemaking to independent agencies, are all developments that sort of start make the traditional state power crumble in a way. And to illustrate how this is developed over time, it's interesting to look at the case of international organizations. So if we take the world of 1945, there are all these states, and at some point they realize that they have these common problems, and they establish an international organization to sort of solve their collective problems. The United Nations is an example, but also the European Union itself. We want to establish a common market, so let's establish this entity in Brussels by which we can create this common market. When they was first created, these international organizations, they were to a large extent an arena by which in which states would fight their respective disputes. And so there, that would entail that the most powerful states would win, the smaller states would lose, etc. So in that sense, the international organizations became an instrument in the hands of more powerful states. That is why sometimes it is argued that the European Union is, let's say, for some time was a bit an instrument in the hands of France and Germany, or that the United Nations is a bit sometimes seen as an instrument in the hands of the United States of America. But what we've also seen over time is that certain international organizations have gained formal independence in the things they could do, in the rules they could make. And we've seen over time a growing amount of international organizations developing as an independent actor. And one of the questions that is one of the main questions in political science today regards the extent to which international organizations sort of exercise some form of independent influence over states. And so if they are somehow giving direction to what states do. So public authority, public policy, political decision-making happening less and less at state level and more at the level of these international organizations. It's an open question in political science that is constantly being debated. But one of the things that has been found is that is that over time we've observed more and more delegation and pooling. That means delegation means that member states, also the national states, have given more and more formal competences to international organizations. And also we have observed that when states are part of an international organization, in the past, they would vote mostly through unanimity, so all states agreeing. And nowadays, international organizations more and more vote through qualified majority, which means that individual states, individual member states, have less authority over or less control over what the international organization decides. And the international organizations where these delegation and pooling are the most developed are the European Union, the IMF, and the World Bank. And the European Union is particularly interesting because, as you can see, it has by far the highest amount of delegation, which in practice means that the European Union, compared to all other international organizations in the world, has a sphere of policy competencies that is much bigger than that of any other international organization. So, for example, the IMF mainly deals with public finances, but the EU deals with public finances, deals with monetary policy, deals with social policy, deals with environmental policy, and so forth. So the European Union has a unparalleled level of policy competences, and in addition to that, it also has a substantial amount of pooling, meaning that a substantial amount of its decision making happens through qualified majority voting. That is that only let's say a 2/3 majority within the European Council is needed to make important decisions. And the more decisions are made through qualified majority voting instead of unanimity, the more this means that individual member states have relatively little control on what international organizations actually decide upon. So international organizations have over time become more numerous in number. Today there are more international organizations than 50 years ago, and they've also increased the number of policy competences that they deal with, and also the level of control that individual member states have over these international organizations has also decreased. In parallel to this development, we have also observed how within the state, the allocation of power has changed. That is, states do not fully control all the aspects of public policy anymore, but they delegate it more and more to independent, non-majoritarian institutions. Perhaps the biggest example is that of monetary policy, that until 30, 40 years ago, governments had a political control over the policies of their central bank. And nowadays, central banks are run by, let's say, economists that are relatively independent in shaping their monetary policy. And there are many reasons for this, but one of them is that in a world where there is so much human interactions across different states, governments also need to make credible policy commitments, and they can no longer and these policy commitments can no longer be undermined by the fact that every electoral cycle we have a political alternation in government. So decision making is being delegated more and more to non-majoritarian institutions. A third development is that, so in addition to the growing relevance of international organizations and these and political power being delegated to independent institutions, we also see that private actors become more and more important. Since the 1980s, the size of multinational corporations has increased, and they have, let's say, taken in bigger chains of the global supply chains. Then we've seen private actors taking charge of public services. I made the example of railways. In some countries, there's often also the discussion of privatizing water supplies. So public goods that are given in the hands of private actors. And a lot of the economic activities that have been happening across borders have often been regulated by the self-made rules of the companies involved. So we've seen, to a large extent, some form of transnational private governance. And this has happened in many spheres, importantly in the financial sphere. So the trading of capital internationally is often regulated through transnational governance. But we've also seen it to some extent in the sphere of military and security. So in giving an example of how the state is, let's say, losing political power vis-a-vis other actors, and in this example that I'm going to give specifically private actors, I give the example of the economy. Traditionally, an economy that happens within a national border, a government collects the taxes through from the activities of its people and its companies. The economic activities within the countries are being taxed. That generates a revenue for the government, and with that revenue, the government generates public spending through which it provides public goods. So it finances education, health, public infrastructure, etc. So the government's public policies, to a large extent, a cycle of these taxes. So these revenues then being spent to deliver public goods. This where does this money of these economies come from? Well, private people within the economy, they lend it from commercial banks, and the money itself is I have to be very delicate here with my. So the money itself is being printed by a central bank. The money itself is being printed by a central bank. Now, the question is if the central bank also can send its printed money also directly to the government. And until central banks were under the political control of governments, this would happen. And this would happen because in the cycle of governments raising taxes from their national economy and then having to spend, sometimes they wouldn't have the money they needed to finance the schools of the hospitals, etc., was not directly available. And then they would ask their central bank to print some money in advance, which they would spend, and then they would pay it back through the revenues of the next year. So governments would also often ask their central banks to print some extra money. In the past 30 years, central banks have been made more and more independent. So this practice of central banks directly financing government expenditure has become, let's say, a not so a practice that is not well accepted within the international community, and particularly in Europe, this is something that is kind of not allowed. The European Central Bank is not allowed to finance government spending. So in this situation, by which governments sometimes still need to find the money to actually find the money to pay the pensions of the next month. So governments, sometimes they go to financial markets to lend money and eventually then pay it back. Of course, this means that the more governments have to lend money from financial markets, who may set the terms on by which this money is being lent, this creates a situation where the government is, let's say, enters a power struggle with big private entities. We know that financial markets are being dominated by large banks, by private financial institutions. And the question, of course, is how powerful governments are vis-a-vis these big banks, these big private actors in financial markets. So given all these developments, an important question today is whether the state is still the main unit of political authority, if it's still the place where the important decisions are being taken. So with the example of financial markets lending their money, the question often arises if these financial markets actually control states, so if they will lend their money to the states only if states spend the money in the ways in which financial markets ask them. Another question is if these financial markets operate in a, let's say, in a way that we would like to sanction, do states have enough power to sanction these actors? Or to make another example, the control that a company like Google has over a lot of data, and if Google infringes certain rules, do states have the power to sanction a company like Google? So more broadly, do states still have the authority to keep non-state actors in check? These are open questions in political science today, and in a way, the consensus among scholars is that, I mean, states are still important. They're still important holders of political authority, but while in the past they sort of had a monopoly over political authority, today they are sort of managers of political authority. That is, so in Europe, for example, if states want to control these financial markets, or if they want to sanction a big digital company like Google, they kind of have to operate, they have to join forces at the European level. And in fact, it's at the European Union's level that we have some of the most advanced legislation in terms of financial regulation or in terms of digital regulation. So just to summarize, state transformations are governments still in charge. We can imagine governments as being the drivers of this car, where the car is, let's say, the collectivity, and as a collectivity we may want to go in a certain direction, we may want to go right or left, and the government is the entity that decides for us, and it decides legitimately because we actually vote for it. So if the government goes right or left, from a democratic point of view, it should be dependent a bit on how we vote for this government. But in order to do so, the government also should be powerful enough to do so. And there are certain constraints to what governments can do. There are certain national checks and balances, because also if a government has a democratic mandate, we would not want it to be able to do whatever it wants. So we have some legitimate constraints, but these constraints have increased over time because, in addition to the national checks and balances to what governments can or cannot do today, we also have international constraints. There are international rules to what governments can and cannot do. I made the example of, for example, central banks financing governments. That is something that at the international level is, let's say, more and more criticized, and in the EU it's actually not allowed. Then car runs on fuel, governments run on money. This money comes more and more from international markets, so no longer from the national central bank, but from international financial markets. And let's say the instrument by which the government goes forward are while perhaps in the past the government would decide on its own on how to best move forward. Today, the decisions on how to move forward, or some aspects on the instruments on how to move forward, are delegated to independent agency. And on top of this, in deciding what's left or right, we rely more and more on, let's say, certain technological developments that are in the hands of private companies, which then raise the question on, and all this together raises the question on whether a government that is democratically elected can autonomously decide whether to go left or right, or whether this is the decision on whether to go left or right is sort of shaped by all these other constraints it is facing. So in our study programs at ESPOL, we deal with all these type of questions, and the different master programs focus on different aspects of this. So the master program on digital in digital politics and governance focuses on those aspects of digital regulation, on how in the EU certain directives and regulations, how advanced they are in providing a framework for having a digital governance. So also how to regulate these important digital companies, but also how the digitalization shapes the democratic process. So how nowadays there are voting advice applications, or through the internet people can interact with each other, and new political alliances are created. The master program in international security and politics focuses more on how the security at the international level, how states still play a role in that, and it focuses particularly also on the concept of sovereignty, on the extent to which sovereignty is still an important concept for understanding international and security politics. Then the master in multi-level governance in Europe focuses on how in the European Union, this national and supranational level, how it is being organized, also because Europe is a part of the world where these state transformations are particularly advanced. So Europe is an interesting case to look at. Then we have a master program that will not be available this September. It's currently under maintenance, but we hope it will be available again from September 2025, which until now was called Food Politics. Perhaps when it will be available in 2025, it might be called something around environmental governance. But so if you're interested in that topic, please stay tuned, but for not the upcoming academic year, but for the next one. So our study programs for the upcoming September are three. So digital politics and governance, then international and security politics, and multi-level governance in Europe. Perhaps a few words on how we structure our master program. In this table, you see the 4 semesters. So it's a 2-year master program. Trying to describe it simply, in semesters 1 and 2, you will have 3 core courses that really define the direction of your master program. So if it's digital politics and governance, you'll have 3 core courses about digital politics and governance. If it's international security, it's 3 core courses on international security. If it's multi-level governance, it's 3 core courses on multi-level governance. In addition to that, students will also have the opportunity to choose then an optional course where the 3, let's say, directions of study kind of come together again. So you'll also have the opportunity to take a course on digital politics, or on international security, or on multi-level governance if your master program is different. Then we also train, we have in the green, you see the research courses, where we train students to actually make their own research. And so these courses in green are sort of designed to train you towards the production of your master thesis. And then we have a few additional things related to career trainings. and study trips where we bring students to important policy-making institutions, so that in this way we combine our academic training with a direct exposure to actual policy-making institutions, and we also give an important value to language training. Importantly, you will see also that in the semesters 3 and 4, let's say the burden of the core courses diminishes, and so the more you advance in your studies, the more time you will dedicate to the writing of your own master thesis. Important also, as part of our concept of combining academic training with, let's say, direct exposure to the policymaking world, you will also be asked and encouraged to do a 4-month internship, either in the summer between semester 2 and semester 3, or at the end of semester 4. Here are the directors of our study programs. For the digital politics and governance, it's a shared directorship between Julia Sandri and Felix Christopher von Nostitz. The director of the Master in International and Security Politics is Sara Dizelle, and for the Master in Multi-Level Governance, it's myself. Perhaps a couple of words, if I have time, about why ESPOL, why come do a study your master program with us. Well, firstly, a geographical consideration. We are a train ride away from Brussels, a train ride away from Paris, and a train ride away from London. And this geographical location makes it sort of facilitates to implement our concept of combining an academic training with sending students to actual policy-making institutions. So the EU is a train ride away from us. In Paris, there are other important international institutions, in London too. And we also organize study trips to Geneva, and in the case of digital governance, to Estonia. So we try, so in some, why choose ESPOL? Because of our combination of an academic training with direct exposure to policymaking institutions. A bit of self-promotion, as I said, I have a book entitled Between Voters and Bureaucrats, How Do Governments Justify Their Budgets in this context of state transformations. But this is the end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to exchanging words with you directly. I'll stop sharing the slides now. And thank you.
Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. So I think that we can go straight to the questions since we have some in the Q&A box. The first one is, what is the role of digitalization in a state power? And does the government has the control of the digitalization in respect to the constitution of that particular state?
Very good question. Well, this is a question that I don't have an answer to. This is a question that needs to be explored, and the training that we offer. I mean, this is a very contemporary question that we don't know as a scholar, as scholars in these fields. We don't really know this, if states control the process of politicization. And what we need to do is to learn how to answer such a question. And in the master program, we train students to develop the tools to actually arrive at such an answer. So it's not meant to disappoint the person that asked the question, but I really want to emphasize this is a very good question, and it's a very contemporary question. And what we need to learn is to develop the tools to answer such a question.
Thank you. So the next one, more delegation for what? Economics reason or market and company development wish for society from society?
More delegation in the sense that, for example, when the European Union was established, it was mostly established around the idea of having a common market. Then when you establish a common market, there are other issues that arise. Like, for example, we have different We have different labor market regulations in the different countries, et cetera, and at some point you need to harmonize that. And the countries, instead of doing this themselves, they delegated this to an independent body. So in the case of Europe, the European Commission, that then became in charge of developing a policy on for example, how to harmonize labor markets in Europe. So often it's not a wish from society. On the contrary, this process of delegation has happened often, let's say, among political elites to solve certain, let's say, supranational problems. And it's interesting that the student asks the question of the wish from society, because what we're witnessing nowadays is a backlash from society, that societies are actually against the fact that governments have been delegating a lot of decision-making to other entities.
Thank you. How do states navigate the balance between delegating authority to international organizations or independent agencies and retaining control over their political power in the 21st century?
Well, again, this is again a very open question to which there is not a straightforward answer. And the best answer I can give to that question is the presentation I gave, in the sense that it's not that straightforward. So states have delegated a lot of their authority to international organizations, and now that the societies are waking up to this and often protest against this, states want to gain control back. But it's not often it's not easy, because this runs into other policy problems. So again, this is again an example of a question that we explore together with the students in the master program, and there is not a straightforward answer to that. I think it also changes a lot from state to state.
Thank you. In the context of technological transformations and the digitalization of public services, how can states ensure the responsible and ethical use of citizens' data, especially considering the increasing involvement of private corporations in handling such sensitive information?
Very good. This falls a bit outside of my area of expertise. My colleagues from the digital governance program would know better, but I would say the most advanced public legislation on these matters is probably within the European Union. So how can states, I cannot read the question anymore, but how can states sort of regulate these digital platforms? The answer coming from the European Union is they kind of have to operate at a supranational level and make legislation that is not national but European. That seems to be the answer emerging from Europe, but it's of course open for further exploration.
Thank you. And have the measures imposed by international organizations helped Africa achieve its economic independence? If what's failing? If not, I think.
Well, some have definitely failed. Some have failed. A lot of the thing with international organizations globally has been that for between the 1980s and almost until today, they have been dominated by a neoliberal paradigm that, and this has gradually been changing over the past 20 years, but this neoliberal paradigm has really dominated a lot of what international organizations have done globally, including Africa. And this entailed that, for example, they thought that in order to increase economic activity in Africa, they should privatize schools, without realizing that if people have nothing to eat, they also cannot send their children to school. And so a lot of the development has stagnated due to the wrong recommendations from international organizations. On the other hand, other let's say facets of for example, the United Nations with UNICEF and the World Food Programme, they have had more positive effects. So it's a complex picture, but there has definitely been a certain degree of failure. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the lecture. My question is, in your opinion, global trade as we knew it before the start of the series of wars in the world is coming to an end and we enter in the era of the regionalization?
Well, yeah, it's hard to predict the future, but it's definitely a global trend that we're both in let's say in national elections and at the level of relations between large states. We are witnessing let's say a backlash to globalization. So the 1990s and 2000s were really the era of globalization, global trade, etc. It was an issue that was not divisive among national electorates. Now, in the past 10 years, we've witnessed Trump, Brexit, and all sorts of similar political developments, which have also contributed to having governments that are more skeptical for trade. And it seems, yeah, that right now we have certainly had a break on the intensification of global trade. That's for sure. And how will this be in the future? That we cannot predict.
Thank you. And when referring to international organizations such as the UN, you mentioned that it is now more based on the majority rather than unanimity. The US has a large history of vetoing several articles. That being said, is the UN still considered to be an international organization that bases its decisions on unanimity, or does the US have a specifically unique role here?
Very good question. So this is a question that can be so this is a question that can be measured. So when I gave that example, that was based on a study that calculated the policy areas in which these, so that graph that I showed with the various international organizations on this diagram, that was based on a calculation of that was from these scholars, that they calculated the share of decision making that happens within that international organization that is based on either unanimity or qualified majority rule. I don't remember now where the UN is standing in that diagram, but that diagram basically means that there is a certain level of decision making that happens with qualified majority voting, and a certain amount of decision making that happens with unanimity. When the US has the power to veto, it means that it's probably unanimity, even though the UN is a bit complicated because it has the Security Council, etc. But this is the type of question that can be measured, and what we or in general master students are taught to do is to measure these kind of things. Like, so in the UN, how much of the decision making is taking place with unanimity, how much with qualified majority voting, how has this changed over time, how does this compare to other international organizations?
Thank you so much. So I think that we have answered to all the questions. Thank you so much for your interesting lecture, and also thank to all the students connected with us today. I would like to remind you that if you want to receive the certificate of attendance for the masterclass, you can click in the link that I'm sending in the chat right now and request it. So thank you so much. We hope to see you again in the next webinar organized by Doxity, and have a nice day and see you soon.
Thank you all for attending, and looking forward to see you at Expo.
Of course, thank you so much. Bye-bye.